Another way, one thing I want you to remember of is that while, for example, Russia was the highest on autonomous leadership, every Russian leader is not necessarily operating that way. The ecological fallacy is applying the results of an entire country to every individual in that country, and that's a false way of doing it. So we're looking at country practice extremes. All of the countries indicated here are at least one standard deviation above normal or below normal. So they're outside of normal parameters. You know, they're social misfits, if you want to put it that way, in terms of the general norm. Again, among the European countries, performance, Switzerland, Albania, Austria, bottom end, Hungary, Greece, Russia. Now, as we look at these, this is all practices as well, too. Institutional collectivism, right in the middle. Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, Scandinavian countries, are very high on that. Italy, East Germany, Hungary, and Greece are very low on institutional collectivism. So as I look then at future orientation, and I see a Swiss leader seeking to work in Italy, and get them to plan far in advance because that's what the Swiss leader values, they're going to have trouble. And I see an Italian leader coming to Austria and seeking to be a leader there in a church, in a Christian organization, in a business, who doesn't care as much about planning for the long-term future, and that's going to generate struggles for the Austrian employees that are there in the situation. Same thing with in-group collectivism. Georgia rating very high, a Georgian leader going to Switzerland, French-speaking Switzerland is going to have problems. A Dane, again the Scandinavian countries, going to Russia is going to have a problem because they likely won't pay attention to the families and the connections. We mentioned Guanxi in the Chinese settings, and Guanxi is what this is measuring in one respect, and so you can see Georgia, Albania, Russia, all East European countries, Switzerland, Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, all West European countries. You can see a significant divide in many of these dimensions between East Europe and West Europe, and how people in those two areas of Europe are dramatically different. It would be interesting to ask whether this difference came before the era of communism or it's something that was built into the cultures as a result of communism, especially when it comes to something like gender egalitarianism. Look at the countries at the top there: Hungary, Russia, Poland, Slovenia, and then you've got Denmark. The countries that are lowest: West and East Germany, Austria, Germanic Europe is very low in this. Switzerland is also part of that, and then Spain as well too. I won't walk through the uncertainty avoidance. Country-based leadership extremes. Now, this is not the same as the cultural practice. This is now what type of leadership do they value. The Irish will value charismatic, value-based leadership. Kazakhstan and France don't value it. You see where France is? They're at least one standard deviation below normal in every category except for participative leadership, and they're the one standard deviation above normal. So the French would highly value participative leadership, but no other type of leadership. If you were to try and minister in France, how might that affect you as a leader? And the French are very deep into long-term friendship and relationships. And it takes time to build that participatory framework, but if you don't pay attention to that, you're going to be in trouble. The humane-oriented, again, Denmark, Russia, France at the bottom end of that. Compassion, generosity, Georgia, Albania, Greece, and Ireland at the top end of that. This ties into pension programs. It can tie into national health systems. Though Denmark, if I'm not mistaken, has a reasonable national health care system. I'm not certain of that. Does anybody know in the class? I want to be careful misstating that. I will be corrected by all of you if I am wrong on that, but I just want you to see at least the direction you're going. It's not valued the way it's defined here in the study. So now let's go broader than just Europe and look at some of the sets of cultural practices and global leadership dimensions. What I'm trying to do is draw a contrast. So I take Russia, from East Europe. I take Nigeria from West Africa. I take the Philippines from Southeast Asia. I take Brazil and from Latin America, and I take Turkey from the Middle East. Russia is very high on gender egalitarianism, much lower on performance, assertiveness, which sounds strange to my ears, future orientation, uncertainty avoidance. And so in other words, they would be lower on having rules and regulations, but they're much higher on autonomous and very low on participative or humane-oriented leadership. Nigeria is high on assertiveness, and Nigerians have a reputation for that, especially among other Africans. They're very high on power distance, but they're low on institutional collectivism. They're average on in-group collectivism. So if you think of Nigeria as a really collectivistic country on a global scale, they're not as collective as many other countries in the world. They're also high on humane-oriented leadership and self-protective leadership. What relationship does that have to the Nigerian economy and the news and the things you hear about Nigeria as well too? Philippines, high on humane orientation, institutional collectivism, and in-group collectivism. Also high on charismatic or value-based leadership, team-oriented leadership, and humane-oriented leadership. Wouldn't be very high on self-protective leadership. It's interesting to think of Marcos in power for so long, a person at the top who was very concerned with self-protective leadership. But once he's been overthrown, then the Philippine economy has skyrocketed. And one part of that is Filipino workers going overseas to work. I wonder what kind of culture shock they experience and how they handle that. Brazil is lower, interestingly, on institutional collectivism, but they're not a standard deviation above the norm in any of the other categories. They're high on team-oriented leadership, participative leadership, and they're very low on autonomous leadership. You want to be part of a group rather than just an individual making the call. Turkey, high on assertiveness, high on in-group collectivism, high on power distance. Those three sound like a dangerous combination, don't they? At least to my ears. Low on gender egalitarianism. Females are not going to be seen in many positions of leadership. And the reality of being a Muslim country might tie into that quite deeply as well, too. So what happens then when we cross cultural divides? Russians and Turks on gender egalitarianism. Russians and Nigerians on assertiveness. Russians, and Turks and Nigerians all in relation to assertiveness. What I'm trying to get you to see is where are spaces where in today's global economy, in today's global mission world, a Filipino church leader going to Brazil is likely to value practices that Brazilians aren't, but perhaps more likely to value them than an American person would. Under the types of leadership, the red arrows again indicate where clashes are likely to be found. What I'm trying to do is lay out for you, without going into detail of a single country, things you need to consider if you're planting churches internationally, but you have to ask yourself if you're planting churches among a community of people, for example, among a Hispanic community, in what sense are they going to buy into similar values as Brazil? And how is that going to change how you go about your church planting work wherever you might happen to be? And so then Eastern European, if I look at Latin Europe, I'm going to go ahead and go all the way across on these. And then give us an example. Nordic Europe is the most interesting place. They're either kind of very high or very low in relation to all the other countries. What I mean by this is I take all the Nordic countries and you average their values and you compare those with the rest of the regions. Relatively speaking, they're high in institutional collectivism, future orientation, gender egalitarianism, uncertainty avoidance, but they're low on assertiveness, in-group collectivism, and power distance. And so now when you start crossing lines, sending a Swedish church planter to Germany, the Swede will not likely value assertiveness, which the Germans do value. How's that going to impact their leadership and how they handle their leadership? So within the countries of Europe, again, I'm going to walk my way through and simply get to the last part. You can see Hungary is the outlier here in terms of having so many things. But the global leadership dimensions, you see France is negative on just about everything. except participative leadership. So the French leader working in Ireland is going to have some problems. The Irish leader working in Hungary has the potential to have some problems. All of these are framed. Oh, I see some of the arrows here need to be corrected right now, so I have to correct those in the next version. I'm assuming those of you who are seeing this on tape have the corrected version of the arrows, because some of the arrows are going to nowhere. Where you see the one autonomous going to nowhere in Germany, I think I carried them over and forgot to erase some of those arrows. Perhaps a confusing picture, a little bit overwhelming, unless you're from a particular area and you're looking at a particular issue. Then the globe study can be very helpful. But you can see why it's a challenge to sink your teeth into it, but it's the most massive study done of leadership, trying to understand leadership and see how culture impacts leadership. In an intercultural comm, I hope if nothing else, it's given you questions to ask when you think of multicultural teams and leadership and how to work that out, and especially when it comes time to dealing with conflict.